Welcome again. I believe we're on, week 5, and we're covering the atonement this week, or the work of Christ. And to some extent, I have already covered the atonement during our week in Christology, and so so you have some notes from there that will work and are applicable to our discussions this week. But I'm going to fill out some of that data today when we talk about the nature of salvation, particularly the atonement, what some have considered the objective side of salvation. So there is a discussion about the objective-subjective distinction, and that comes up in more than one context, and sometimes it's it's somewhat ambiguous what theologians are talking about. Oftentimes when they're talking about salvation and they bring up the subjective-objective distinction, the objective side is discussing the actual act of the atonement itself, where Christ makes salvation actually or possibly. And then the subjective side has to do with the relationship between God and his saints or human creatures, and how freedom of the will comes into play in that sense therein. But when we talk about the atonement, sometimes theologians will make a distinction between subjective and objective theories of the atonement, where on the objective side, some theories of atonement actually say that Christ actually does something in his death that brings some new effect out in humanity or cosmically in the world, something that's new and different, some sort of objective change that's non-dependent upon what you and I do. And then there are other subjective theories that are directed not at some objective change, but to elicit some sort of subjective change or subjective response. And so those are two distinctions that are often made between objective and subjective in the salvation discussion. Right. So I hope you're doing well this week. I hope the readings are coming along and you're enjoying them. Looking forward to the discussions. One of the things about this class that I want to talk about here a little bit more, because I do have some experience in this area, is the nature of doing apologetics itself. One of the things that we prize here in the apologetics program at HBU is literary and artful apologetics. Not merely just philosophical apologetics, but learning how to artfully, creatively, and freshly present the truths of Christianity or the truths of the gospel in a persuasive and rhetorically interesting manner, in a way that addresses or is directed at contemporary needs of the day. And so that's something important that we prize in the apologetic discussion. We need people that are artful and that are compelling in their presentation. And I think there's something virtuous and valuable in that that's not strictly reducible to how well you put your words together, but that's certainly important. It seems to me that as we're dealing with popular apologists of the day for alternative religious perspectives, or for the atheist, particularly the new atheist, which we'll spend some time on toward the end of the class, we need to come up with fresh, creative responses to them. Many of the objections that the new atheists are raising specifically deal with theological issues, and these are issues that if you have a good, solid, rudimentary understanding of Christian theology, you can respond to most of the new atheist charges. But it's doing so in a manner that's creative and artful, that really matters. And I think we need more of this. We need more substantive thoughtful, creative, fresh presentations of Christian truth that is compelling. And so oftentimes in discussions, you either have these sort of highfalutin sort of academic discussions, and I think those are important. We need to have those. We need academics to encourage and motivate their own subculture, Christian culture. But then we also have popular apologists that lack a lot of substance, and their argumentation is often not very good, and they're not contributing anything that's really thick and substantive into the conversation that's communicated well. So you do have these sort of opposites in the discussion. But we need more people trained theologically and philosophically to communicate in the popular culture in a way that's compelling. And I think we see some people doing that. Certainly Tim Keller is one person who has done that well, and he's sort of struck that balance. There's others who have done that well, who are able to communicate and bring the cookie jar down to the bottom shelf, but also to communicate something of substance that's worthwhile. When we get into atonement theories, and I want to talk a little bit about that, this is an area that I've spent some time thinking, not only at an academic level, but also trying to write more pop-level pieces that are fresh and compelling for a much wider audience. And so I've attached a couple of pieces up on your module for this week to read. Two of them are pop-level pieces. One is dealing with one variation of penal substitution that I think is a theologically dangerous development within evangelical circles that needs to be addressed. And the other one is just simply presenting a modified Anselmian theory of the atonement. So you have those. I hope you'll read them and bring them into the discussions. Hopefully you'll find them useful and helpful. But let me jump into some of the atonement theories. The atonement is one aspect of salvation, albeit an important aspect of salvation, that fits within the broader biblical narrative of redemption. So if you think about the broader biblical narrative as including creation, fall, salvation, and then eschatology, it fits within redemption as the solution to humanity's fundamental problem. And what Christ does is he solves that fundamental problem on our behalf. So we have this problem, we need fixing. Christ comes along and he fixes that problem. Well, there's different atonement theories that are on offer, and there's several of these you've already read about in the Thomas Oden book, and you've read a little bit about this in Mere Christianity, and you will have read some of the pieces that I've put forward. But one thing that I wanted to say about Thomas Oden's book is that, while very helpful, there is a clear tendency, which is common among systematic theologians, there's a clear tendency in atonement theories to talk about, rather than talk about actual theories, right, that actually do something themselves and have some sort of integrity themselves, he talks about various themes of the Bible that have been some sort of codified into theories. And he also has a tendency to talk about various motifs rather than talking about theories themselves. So toward the end of his discussion, he talks about this idea that these are all sort of aspects or motifs of one larger plan of redemption. And I think I think that's a very common move today amongst biblical and systematic theologians. But I want to discuss them in a slightly different way. Not to say that that's per se wrong. I think it's missing something important in the discussion. I want to talk about them as models of atonement that have some sort of integrity and structure themselves. No doubt there are themes and motifs within each theory that we can work out in a broader sort of a soteriology. But the atonement itself, it seems to me, is, strictly speaking, interested in dealing with the mechanism of what makes us right with God, or what resolves the fundamental problem that we have with God. And this is often, these are often talked about as being restitution theories of atonement. But you might think that there are other theories of atonement that are non-restitution in nature, but they themselves still have some sort of integrity. For example, like the Christus Victor theory, which Thomas Oden spends so much time talking about, and then when he moves into victory in the next chapter, he develops this theme of Christus Victor. Christus Victor is this idea, in a nutshell, that Christ is victorious over death, and he brings about life, which is a common theme in Scripture, right? If you look at the covenants, God gives us patterns of how to enter into the life that He's given to mankind in the covenants, and He blesses us with life when we follow, or when we obey, or meet the conditions of the covenant that He's given us. But when we don't, well, what's the consequence? The consequence is death. So when Adam and Eve sinned, their fundamental problem was death. And Christ is the one ultimately who comes and brings life by conquering death, by becoming victorious over death. Well, there's various ways to work out the Christus Victor theory. You might say that in His death, He conquered death. And so there is some kind of mechanism there that is at work. But you also might say there's other non-restitution focused theories of the atonement which want to say something like Christ actually provides the paradigm that was otherwise not present for us to imitate. So some sort of imitation theory of the atonement, which certainly Lewis in Mere Christianity has these aspects of imitation present in how he works out the atonement. There's certainly other theories that are more participatory in nature, where Christ comes and He provides the means by which we participate in God, which is our life. But then there's these restitution theories of atonement, and the intent there in these restitution theories is to make something right that has gone wrong, oftentimes in a legal framework. And there's two common theories that I want to touch on here, namely Anselm's satisfaction theory. There's variations of the satisfaction theory throughout church history, but Anselm is most famous for starting this discussion. And then what's later developed has some similarities to satisfaction, but it's called the penal substitution theory, which is or has been made popularized by John Calvin. So I want to talk about those briefly with you. Penal substitution is the most common theory accepted today in evangelical circles, as well as in Reformation circles. And I must say that most don't distinguish between satisfaction and penal substitution very well. They either look at satisfaction theory as being a sort of gateway to penal substitution, or they look at Anselm's satisfaction theory as being a kind of culturally relevant way of talking about the atonement, rather than a theory unto itself that provides some unique mechanism. Most in evangelical circles who actually engage with the satisfaction theory see it as just basically a penal substitution theory or something close to it, something that needs more development. You read the satisfaction motif, or you will read, in Odin. I must say that I wasn't entirely pleased with his treatment of satisfaction, and I found it lacking in several ways. And part of that's why I posted some extra articles up there so you can read. I've spent some time in satisfaction in developing it, what I would call the reparative substitution theory of atonement. But what's going on in the satisfaction? At its heart, I think what Anselm was doing was he was saying that, look, if we think about the world or the cosmos as a kind of kingdom where God is the king, he's the monarch, and we are his subjects. And God has given us, in terms of the covenantal relationship we have with him, he's given us certain conditions and obligations. But when we don't fulfill those conditions, we actually, by way of not obeying the law, we actually bring dishonor to God and to the moral order that he has set in place. And so for Anselm, our primary debt is a debt of honor. We owe this debt of honor to God, being the subjects in his kingdom. And so that's our fundamental problem. So what Christ does on the satisfaction theory is he comes and he satisfies our debt of honor to God on our behalf. So whatever we owe to God, he fulfills whatever we owe. By accruing a certain amount of satisfaction or righteousness, Christ is then able to somehow pay a credit to God on our behalf. You might think of it as the exchange in this way. Christ is actually paying money into our account that is lacking. In this case, we lack a certain amount of funds that will sufficiently honor God. So Christ pays into our account in such a fashion that he pays what we owe to God, or what we owe to the moral order. So this is the satisfaction theory in a nutshell. I'm going to, as you'll see in my articles that I've posted, let me just distillate for you a more developed, modified version of Anselm's satisfaction theory that I think is better, ultimately. Here's how we've sort of distilled the essential points to our theory of satisfaction. 1, Christ's atonement is necessary to his work, right? Just like on penal substitution. 2, Christ's death is an act of divine self-love. In other words, Christ dies motivated by love for the Father. 3, Christ's death procures an infinite merit by procuring a sufficient amount of righteousness that he can pay into our accounts. Christ's death pays the full sum of humanity's debt of honor to God on our behalf. In other words, he sets aright the moral order that God has put in place. And the infinite merit of Christ's death pays the full sum of humanity's debt of honor. Christ's death is sufficient for all of humanity, and this is something very clear in Anselm. Christ's death is sufficient for all, and this is something that Thomas Oden brings out quite clearly when he develops the atonement. But what he doesn't bring out, and this is, I think, arguably a deficiency in his treatment of the atonement, but it may just be the influences of his Wesleyan tradition. He lacks a sort of understanding of efficacy or efficiency. What does Christ do efficiently for humanity or for the saints? And this is something that you see much more common in the Calvinistic tradition on the atonement. And I would suggest to you that the way that we've developed it, there's two things that Christ does efficiently or effectively. One is he literally and actually pays the debt of humanity to God by making the moral order aright in our world. Right? So that's one thing that he does effectively, not just sufficiently, effectively. But also, and this is something that Thomas Oden does bring out when he's developing the atonement theory toward the end, he effectively brings about eternal salvation for those who are united to Christ by faith. And so we would agree with that in our variation of Anselm's satisfaction theory. All right. So let me move on to the penal substitution theory. As you can see in the name, the penal substitution theory is a substitutionary in nature. Christ is doing something on our behalf as humans, or on the behalf of, if you're a Calvinist, on behalf of those whom God has elected and chosen to apply the atonement to. So there's a couple ways of working out penal substitution. One is to say that Christ's death is sufficient for all as a sacrifice, or that Christ's death is sufficient only, maybe it's sufficient for all, but it's sufficient only for some, for those some that God has elected and chosen to apply Christ's atonement to. But what's important about the penal substitution theory is that Christ isn't paying a debt of honor to God in the same way that we find in Anselm's satisfaction, but rather that Christ is paying a debt of punishment or a debt of penalty. He is actually absorbing the debt of penalty in himself, and by absorbing the debt of penalty in himself, he eliminates the debt that we owe or that would otherwise come to us. He eliminates that debt by absorbing it in himself. So that's an important distinction. The key proponent, of course, is John Calvin, and arguably penal substitution wasn't around in any developed sense or at all prior to John Calvin. There are some evangelicals today who would like to say that penal substitution has been around in the early church, at least in seed form, and that Christ offered himself as this sacrifice, but not just any sacrifice, but as the one who bore the punishment for our sin and brought about reconciliation between us and God based upon this legal transaction between us and Christ. But this really is one of the more striking components or features of the penal substitution theory. Christ actually pays not just a general penalty, but Christ actually pays your penalty and absorbs your debt, the debt that you accrued from whatever law you had violated or whatever laws you have violated. He actually pays that debt. So that's a distinction between penal substitution and satisfaction theory. In one theory, Christ is actually assuming the debtor's penalty. So he is absorbing what is owed to the debtor. In the other case, in the satisfaction theory, Christ is actually paying a credit. He's actually giving a gift to God. He's doing something positive. You don't have the same positive act in the penal substitution theory? Well, there's several objections that have been raised to the penal substitution theory. One is, of course, that it's too bloody, it's too violent. The other is, well, the resurrection doesn't seem to have any role to play in the atonement. Another is, well, why can't God just forgive? Another is, well, it's just literally, and I think this is the most compelling objection to penal substitution, it's just literally impossible or incoherent for an innocent victim to assume the debt of punishment of the victimizer, the one who's the violator. And this is often called, in varying forms, this is called the legal fiction objection. And I think this is the most compelling objection to penal substitution. So, in a nutshell, those are the theories of atonement. Hopefully that was helpful and useful. We'll end it there and look forward to the discussions. Thanks.